Hello. If you came to many of our churches, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Christian faith is really just for the old. But of course, across the world, it's a very different picture. Across the world, for every 100 Christians, only 10 are over 64. Most are between the ages of 15 and 64, and many are under 15. And Christian faith being just for the old is not how the Bible sees it. I want to look for a moment at a verse that says this: remember your Creator while you're still young, before the bad times come when you say, I have no pleasure in them. That's probably the opposite of what many people think. It's easy to think, well, let me enjoy life first, and then maybe I'll think about God. This says the opposite. And for the rest of this talk, I want to think about why that might be. And first of all, I want to tell you about this. Many of my friends laugh at me about this because it's a paper diary. They all keep their electronic diary on their phones, but I still find this an easier way of handling things. But the thing about having a paper diary is you can't delete anything from it. And this is my diary for 2020, which means that it's full of things that never happened. The first few months are okay, but then about the middle of March, there was a trip down to London that after some deliberation I decided I wasn't going to take. And then it all changes. There's the musical Oliver that I was planning to go and see, but wasn't able to. There are meetings and church services that never happened. Days out and holidays that were cancelled. Other things that had to be rearranged. A year ago, I'd never heard of Zoom, but now meetings happen there rather than face to face. And the thing that 2020 has reminded us is something that's always been true, but we've tried to convince ourselves that it's not. And that is that the future is uncertain and out of our control. We like to think that if we are clever enough or plan carefully enough, the future's in our control. But the answer is that it isn't. And that's where that verse that talks about remembering your Creator while you're still young comes in. Because it comes from what many people think is a very strange book of the Bible that doesn't really fit. It's a book called Ecclesiastes, hidden away in the middle of the Old Testament. And what the writer of the book seems to do is to say, for a moment, let's leave God out of the picture and take a hard, long look at what he calls life under the sun, life that leaves God out. And the answer to life that he comes to is that it's all just meaningless. Meaningless, meaningless. All is meaningless or empty is how the book begins. Smoke, smoke, nothing but smoke. It's all a waste of time. But then, right at the end of the book, he brings God back in. Remembering your Creator while you're still young is the way to face an uncertain future with courage and with joy. we're not in control, but God is. And so the very last words of the book of Ecclesiastes say this: the most important thing a person can do is to respect God and obey his commands. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it's good or evil. That may sound rather uncomfortable, but the first point that it makes is that God's going to win. I don't know if you know those times on the evening news just before match of the day when the sports reporter says, if you don't want to know the final score, look away now. Well, in this case, we do want to know the final score, because that's what makes sense of the whole, if we know where things are heading. And the final score, the final result is that God wins. And the second thing it says is that what we do matters. You might think that if the future's so uncertain, well, there's no point in anything that we do, because it's not going to make any difference. But this says what we do does matter. But what matters is not what we judge as a success, but whether what we do is for or against God's plan, God's purpose to remake a broken world. Here's how the poet T.S. Eliot puts it in a poem called Choruses from the Rock. He says, I say, take no thought of the harvest, but only of proper sowing. The harvest, in other words, is God's job. What we have to make sure of is that we sow according to his plan. Or a few days ago, Bishop Gill tweeted a quotation from St. Anthony. We must not worry about knowing what is to come, but about carrying out what we've been told to do. But there's more. Because as a Christian, the reason I know that God's going to win is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And what that means is that God didn't win by throwing his weight about, but by dying a cruel and shameful death on the cross for us, for me. God wins, but the way he wins is not the way of naked power, but the way of courageous, sacrificial love. We can face the future boldly because it's in the hands of God. He is the God of victory and judgment. But more importantly, he's the God who loved us enough to come and die for us. He had to die because that was the only way he could judge and destroy evil and injustice without destroying us. He's the God of victory and judgment, but also the God of forgiveness. God wins. What we do matters. But when we fail him, he comes looking for us, picks us up, and gives us the chance of a new start with him. As well as pandemics, the other time when the future has looked very uncertain is wartime. In 1939, at the start of the Second World War, King George VI gave a Christmas radio broadcast and read a poem by Minnie Louise Haskins. A recent book tells us that it was handed to him by his 13-year-old daughter, who of course is now our Queen. The poem is all about how to face an uncertain and troubling future, about what it means to remember your Creator while you're still young. And so I'm going to close by reading part of that poem. It goes like this. And I said to the man who stood at the gate of the year, "Give me a light that I may tread safely into the unknown." And he replied, "Go out into the darkness and put your hand into the hand of God. That shall be to you better than light and safer than a known way." So I went forth, and finding the hand of God, trod gladly into the night. And he led me towards the hills and the breaking of day in the lone east.